So I'm Mark Weber of the Computer History Museum. I'm here on August 1st, 2024 with Victor Lee, a professor at Stanford specializing in the use of generative AI in education. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Could you give us your name and then, I said your name. Could you just tell us in a couple of sentences your general background, what led to your interest in AI assistance for education?
My name is Victor Lee. I'm a professor of education at Stanford University, and my background includes training in cognitive science, which, as an interdisciplinary field, has really incorporated artificial intelligence, going back to both connectionist models that have led to a lot of the neural network and deep learning approaches that are in vogue today, as well as symbolic modeling, going back to some of the earlier history of AI. So that's been a persistent interest for me. My doctoral work is in a field called learning sciences, which really thinks a lot about how do we apply what we know about the human mind, computation, AI into learning spaces, and in particular education, such as in schools or other institutions. As of late, AI has been a very hot topic, and so the interest in some of the things that I've been thinking about for decades is quite high right now.
Great, thank you. And can you briefly explain how chatbots, or really generative AI, are currently being used in education? And how are educators integrating them into their lesson plans or curricula?
Right now in education, the use of chatbots is quite tentative. There's a lot of nervousness amongst schools, teachers, and superintendents, but there are some teachers and students who are being more adventurous and see this as part of what's just coming in the future and something that could be very beneficial for learning. One thing that's especially interesting about how chatbots are being used in education is that teachers are actually heavier users than students, according to a lot of the recent data. And the teachers are very interested in it being a tool for lesson planning, for creating custom examples for their students, for picking up some new content information that's related to relevant things that are going on in society right now to help incorporate into their lessons. They're also interested in using it to streamline some other activities, such as some standard communications that they need to do within their role as teachers. But they also will do some novel things, such as use it as a tool in the classroom when it's on display and have a class debate against the chatbot, or to critique the accuracy of what a chatbot has generated. Now, as far as how students are using chatbots in education, a lot of them are using it more on their own time if it's not something that's permitted in the classroom. But one of the big things is just to have it explain stuff to them. There's a lot of self-consciousness about not understanding something and being public about that. And so asking the chatbot to explain a topic or re-explain it in simpler terms, or even test their understanding of a new topic in school is one of the big uses. What we're not seeing in the current research is a large amount or a large increase in plagiarism from chatbots. That's been the most immediate concern about how chatbots might have been used in education, was that students would just use it to write their entire essays, copy and paste, and send that in as their own. And while there's always been cases of students using some service or some resource, whether it's been chatbots or paper mills or some other students' work, there are always those occasional cases of that, but by and large, we are not seeing that wholesale. There's a sense among students that that's crossing a line, but things leading up to it to make their writing better, to help give them ideas when they have a writing assignment, just because getting that first thought started can be really intimidating. So those are a few of the use cases. There's also others ways in which education and chatbots are coming together with new tutoring possibilities and using things like Khanmigo from Khan Academy and a lot of other new chatbots that are coming out to be supportive of on-the-demand content requests.
And I interviewed Sal Khan for Khanmigo, and then a student using it in the Khan school. Now that was very heavily customized from ChatGPT to what I remember is it doesn't give the answer so much as prompt the student to say it for themselves. Are there other chatbots that are as sort of customized for teaching as Conmigo?
There's definitely some things that are appearing. So, for example, in the Silicon Valley, CK12.org has been doing a lot with chatbot customization, both for teachers' use and for students' use. And they have a large repository of open educational resources that they use, and also similarly approach this as how can we help the students learn more rather than just give information on the fly. So there will be prompting, some ideas, or even giving some multiple choice responses to see which thing makes the most sense to them, or how do they think that this idea could be extended further. So the folks who are being very thoughtful about how chatbots could be used in a tutoring context are thinking about it as how do we build on what we know about learning, how question asking, how prompting students to give their own explanations or to extend their thinking can be more beneficial rather than just sticking the next problem on the screen for them.
And so I guess the tutoring you mentioned brings out, is the core use of chatbots in education primarily teaching, supplemental tutoring, a classroom aid? What is the relationship that's evolving, or are there many, between the chatbot, the teacher, and the student?
Currently, the relationship for chatbots in the classroom as far as teachers and students are concerned is still being explored. The very first thing when we started seeing how generative AI was improving with some of the chatbot technologies was to look at tutoring, to think about the custom personalized tutor for every student. This was just further extending this personalized, customized curriculum idea that we know has benefits associated with it, and treating each student as a unique individual with their own interests and their own background knowledge. One of the things that we have seen, though, is that teachers are amongst the heavier users of chatbot technology rather than students. And the work of teaching involves a lot of lesson planning, new assignment creations, trying to customize things because they might be given something from their curriculum, but to make it more relevant or aligned with the things that are going on for their class or for their student population or in their district. There's adjustments that had to be made, and it takes quite a bit of time to develop those, and those become quite valuable for teachers. Using it as a way to help with assessment, to give summaries of what is in general being said through a lot of student assignments, helps teachers to balance the big picture of what's going on in class, to complement when they individually assess student work, to look at the fine details of that. So those are some of the ways that teachers are doing it, but there's, of course, interesting new uses happening where it's a co-pilot for the teacher, that it can pull things up on demand for them. If they wanted a dynamic simulation to be brought on demand, given certain parameters, to be able to do that, to have that be an example generator and something that the class and the teacher look at and reflect on together. It could also potentially generate information for the teacher in terms of which students are having the most difficulty with specific assignments. And so that way the teacher can think about who to pair the students with, when and how to involve themselves in some of those conversations. And there's a lot of hope that it could be a tool to support collaborative learning, helping to monitor how people are participating and who hasn't spoken up recently. Has the group entertained all of the ideas that have been raised, especially if some of them may be fruitful for their further conversation? One of the things that students need to learn through the process of collaboration is how to collaborate. But part of that is having a tool that supports that and prompts them until they ultimately internalize that, and that becomes part of their routine practice.
So you're talking about a chatbot being in the live real time with the class, listening to what's said.
Yes. One of the cases would be, for example, voice assistants that are going to be more responsive to situations, but it can also be something where students are interacting and you could get matched up with one other student in the class because it's seeing what some of the ideas are or how you might be able to complement one another. So these are some of the things that are being explored. In addition, there's ways to help it facilitate with tasks that we know are really time-consuming in class, like coding and debugging software. Oftentimes, writing and programming syntax can be really overwhelming, and dealing with something like a missing semicolon or trying to remember exactly the specific name of a function. So this is a way that we're seeing a lot of educational technology going, which is to help support the low-level programming, command recall things, and rather facilitate the ability to focus on the computational thinking about what is the larger structure or the questions you're asking or how you want to partition the overall program to work in a certain way. So looking at it as a support to keep students' eyes on the ball for what it is that they're trying to learn, so that way there's less interruptions to monitor all these smaller details.
And for the example you're giving of live in the classroom, is that being done now, or people are thinking about it? And if it's being done now, can you describe a couple of typical scenarios?
It's still a frontier use currently with projects that are developing it. So I know at Stanford, for example, there's been a lot of work looking at collaboration in action and seeing where and how the right support is introduced with something like a voice assistant or with multiple people working with a chatbot interface, whether or not they're co-located or they're in a remote learning situation. And so building out some of the scaffolds for that. And that's a current active project to this day. There are also situations, for example, with students who are multilingual or continuing to develop in some of their language and communication skills to facilitate that. So there's some active work happening based out of Buffalo right now that is looking at special education and learning differences and how can we use generative AI and chatbot technology to facilitate more participation, being able to get at or support the expression of good ideas that the students already have but may have some difficulty communicating. Multiple languages is an area for chatbots because increasingly in a very heterogeneous society, you have a lot of different backgrounds and students coming in who have maybe themselves recently come to the country or their parents had come to the country. And so getting familiar with all the language things that happen in a U.S. classroom and being able to participate and be evaluated on the quality of their ideas rather than specific punctuation rules that we now have AI technology to help support already is another frontier use.
So like when you say frontier use, meaning there are classrooms where educators are trying this out on a kind of experimental
basis, yeah. One of the things that's hard right now is by and large, chatbot usage is not, school districts have not taken a strong position in terms of integrating chatbots, but there is use that is happening. Right now, school districts are still trying to make sense of what are going to be the best uses, and in education, there's always these privacy concerns and regulations to consider. And so even having things that are available, like looking at ChatGPT, the minimum usage is 13 unless you get some additional consent. And so that raises some things to be very mindful of as well. So there are uses with teachers who are being exploratory. Milpitas Unified, for example, in the Silicon Valley is being very thoughtful and exploratory with how to use AI in the classrooms and the chatbot.
What are they trying, for example?
A lot of the examples I've described, for example, which was to have debates against the AI or have some initial writing prompts generated from it, are some of the bigger use cases that we're talking about. There's some things also where they're using...
And for what ages would that be?
They are a K-8 district, so they're focusing heavily on the middle school. uses. But there's some other technologies like dynamic camera, like the swivel technology is beginning to integrate some chatbot. Swivel is a technology that you can place an iPad on and it will automatically move the camera to whoever's speaking. And this can be really valuable for a few different use cases. One is for the teacher, because teachers using video to look at what happened in class is one of the best known ways to help teachers get better at teaching in a very complex environment. But there are situations where you may have a future remote participant in a largely in-person class. And so that allows for being able to see what's going on, who's speaking, and what's happening. There has been technology in the past, the Kubi, for instance, which translates to neck.
Telepresence robots.
Telepresence, yeah. And just, we take for granted that we can shift our gaze and by moving our heads. And that's actually a big deal in a classroom where people are seated all around you. And so they have been playing a bit with the swivel technology, which I believe operates out of Menlo Park.
Interesting. Yeah, we've used the beam telepresence robots here.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that. And where, which specific tasks or subject matter areas have educational chatbots been particularly effective or look most promising, and others where they're less promising?
Right now, chatbots have a real difficulty with mathematics, just by virtue of the process by which they're trained and how they respond. They're not engaging in arithmetic computations in the same way that humans do. And so it's pretty easy to generate errors or incorrect mathematical derivations with a chatbot. So while the Khan Academy Conmigo technology is focusing a lot on mathematics because there are a lot of ways and important reasons to focus on mathematics, there are some things that chatbots need to improve upon further, and it's possible with certain adaptations or certain plugins. Increasingly, the attention for chatbots in education has been with English and composition, thinking about it in terms of helping with writing, helping to strengthen your points, to give counterpoints to what your argument is, and thinking about it as a partner or collaborator in articulating ideas. So there's been more research coming out now about how students use it or how English teachers could use it in the classroom. There is still, however, the anxiety and uncertainty that comes along with chatbots in the English classroom, which is the fear that students won't engage in the full composition process. But there are ways that are being explored right now for how it can just be a direct support, and that a lot of students that we're seeing are genuinely interacting with chatbots to get some starter ideas, to give a first sentence, given some ideas that sounds like a good way to phrase something, and then that helps to get the ball rolling for them.
And on the plagiarism front, or having the chatbot do it all for you, we are going to show a screenshot of Turnitin. Mm-hmm. You're saying, though, that has turned out to be kind of a paper tiger it's not as big of a deal as people thought.
With the plagiarism, it's complicated in that there are definitely cases that are happening, but there's a distinction that should be drawn between what's happening in higher education and what's happening in K-12, or predominantly high school. With higher education, you have a selection bias in terms of that's not the entire population of young people. There are other things that we know in the academic integrity research literature that mitigate cheating or mitigate plagiarism sorts of behaviors. And one of those is feeling connected to your teachers. And in high school, you see your English teacher on a daily basis or almost daily basis if you're in a block schedule. You know them, they know you. They see a lot of your writing throughout the entire school year. You're doing some of that writing in class and at home. and the teacher is there and part of it. And so in some sense, plagiarizing feels like disappointing somebody. It also feels riskier because it's something that a teacher can exercise their judgment and say, that doesn't quite sound like the way you usually write. Now, in higher education, oftentimes we're looking at large lecture classes that have discussion sections, and that might involve a teaching assistant and a professor, and who is reading a given paper and the volume of papers that is coming in can be a very different dynamic than what you see in high schools. So different readers not even being sure that the instructor knows your name and only having one term paper or two term papers to complete makes for a different situation. Now, you'd mentioned Turnitin, and there's these other detector technologies, and they're absolutely getting evidence of or indicators that suggest AI use. And there's two things to consider in that is one, what ways in which the selection of Turnitin as a service to use as an educator might do to increase the numbers. So if you are concerned that there is going to be a plagiarism problem, then you would be more inclined to want detector software. And so that may overly sample certain populations. Other things that make it complicated is plagiarism gets to be a much more complicated idea if you start looking at, well, it gave me the overall argument structure, but I chose the words. Or I did the entire argument, but I asked it to phrase it better for me, or I asked it to proofread for me, or I asked it to get me started with the first paragraph, and then I did the rest, or vice versa. And so the fine distinction as to what was strictly my work, purely my creativity, gets to be very complicated, because creativity is really a function of us and the environment and tools around us. It's part of why, to spark creativity, we try to go to environments with a lot of interesting stimuli and toys, and create permission to put out really zany ideas and reward really zany ideas. And so that part gets a little bit messy. Now, there's other things that even if we see or we think that there is use of AI, oftentimes it's associations with word or phrasing that has certain qualities to it. Sometimes it's just the presence of the word delve, for example, which has been quite popular, that AI tends to say, let's delve into that topic more, and people don't drop that as conversation typically. But sometimes it looks at or it produces phrasing that has a very plain quality that doesn't seem to exhibit a lot of personal style or prestige to it. And what's concerning about that is for students who are still developing as writers, students for whom English is not their first language, they may not necessarily be able to imbue the stylistic things through those media yet. And so there's a high risk of being inaccurately labeled as having used it. So those are some of the concerns that we're seeing in there. And really what we're seeing is evidence or data that suggests usage, but ultimately we don't know if they had actually used it. It is suggestive, though.
And that actually we have in the caption that there's a higher chance of non-native English speakers being labeled as AI generated text.
Absolutely.
That's been borne by
studies.
And
what I've generally said before with the ways of using chatbot detection technology is, there is always some percentage that it hits correctly, but there is some percentage that it hits incorrectly. So there's some percentage of students who are going to be correctly identified as having used AI in ways that were not allowed, and there are going to be some percentage of students who are going to be identified as using AI who did not. And what is the threshold that we're comfortable with, especially when it comes with young people, and what message that this sends to them long term? If they are still learning how to express themselves and develop their writing style and get incorrectly identified as having done something that was unsanctioned, that could be a real blow to their self-esteem, their willingness to continue to participate in their feelings about what the education system or what opportunities they should be pursuing. And so I think that we need to be very thoughtful about what, if any, threshold we're okay with, and what are the levels of consequences associated with that.
And are most uses of educational chatbots personified? Like, Conmigo is an example. Or, Socrates is your philosophy teacher or whatever. Are most personified or some not?
There's certainly a mix of personification usage with chatbot technology. Some will produce or present with a avatar or a very clear identity or brand, such as Conmigo, which is a specific entity. And school districts that have experimented with this have tried to create their own icon for it, or companies will put forward some virtual avatar that looks like a person or looks like an animal or some other creature. But a lot of times the use is just with this specific chatbot technology, so just ChatGPT or Gemini, and chatting with that. But what we don't know for certain yet is how much the student or the teacher is subconsciously personifying that technology. In general, we're still seeing some of the initial research coming out, but for people who are not as familiar with artificial intelligence or how it works, from hearing things that are going on in the news, being impressed by seeing some of these chatbot technologies at work, there's a good number of people who feel like this is something that may be sentient and that could be part of their subconscious interactions with it, that it keeps track of things, that it knows them. There are technologies, however, that are inviting users to create personas for them. So there's an app called Poe, where you create your own chatbot and you specify the ways in which it would interact, what sorts of things it would be expert in, and what it might try to teach or communicate to somebody. Another example of a chatbot with personification is the technology used by Replica. And Replica is an interesting case. At Stanford, there's been research on some surprising positive impacts for Replica in reduction of suicide ideation, which is a really interesting thing to consider when we look at the concerns we have about mental health, especially amongst youth in schools nowadays. But beyond that, using Replica, and given that there's so much training data that has developed it in such a way that it tends to want to be romantic, even if you don't want it to be. And that creates some pretty awkward situations. So that may be something we are not as motivated to promote in schools, but just in terms of personification. I know for Replica, you can pick the appearance of your avatar. If you pay for the service, you get more ways to adjust its appearance and other sorts of qualities of the avatar.
And character AI was also kind of targeted more at kids, right?
Yeah, I haven't played with character AI as much, but one that I can talk about is there's Immersion, which was a simulation tool for a virtual classroom, and this was an idea to help train teachers to talk to a classroom and engage with it. And so there were avatars of specific students who would then comment or respond to things. And they're exploring better chatbot integration, because with all of the things that some of the new large language models were facilitating or enabling looked really compelling. But from my experience with Immersion, there's still this pretty big uncanny valley in there, because the virtual students never break eye contact with you. It's a bit eerie.
God, that does sound...
Yeah. They also start talking in like very full sentences, and it's just not the way that people talk.
Wow. I'll have to check that out. Um, and I mean, ChatGPT was obviously big early on, but I mean, what are the main models behind that people are experimenting with in education, or is it all of them at this point?
Right now in education, ChatGPT has gotten so much attention as one of the first visible chatbot technologies that's where a lot of ed tech companies are looking at and using the API and credits that are associated with OpenAI and ChatGPT. There is some usage of it from Google, but you have to keep in mind that with Google and Gemini, they're really integrating it into so much more of their technology. And Google has a really strong presence in classrooms with Google Classroom, although the rollout of generative AI, especially given privacy concerns and data concerns, is not at the rate at which, for example, search or Google Suite, like Google Docs and Slides and Sheets technology. So there are ways in which that is being encountered, but by and large, it's tending to be OpenAI. There's a few startup companies that are using some other technologies and models. I have to check. There's one that I remember is popular, and it starts with an I, but I can't get it off the top of my head. But they're trying to position themselves for education. Merlin Mind is also trying to position itself for education with a education-friendly chatbot. So various startups are looking at this, and there's talk about whether there needs to be an education-specific or education-friendly chatbot technology, which may be trained with data that are not going to introduce content that we think could be inappropriate in there, or would be very specialized given the way in which certain terminologies are used in different subjects or disciplines. And that's been a very recent conversation about what that infrastructure would look like and how we might incentivize building such a large language model.
But like an open source language model specifically for education?
Potentially, yeah. Open source would be a value for, I think, everyone in the open source community and for education, which that's an added expense on already a costly endeavor. There has been, of course, at Stanford, Alpaca and other open source large language models. But right now, with copyright concerns and everyone thinking about what are the training data, there's a lot to be figured out right now in terms of what are the most ethical and appropriate legal ways to build these models and build these chatbots. Of course, there's also talk about, locally stored rather than cloud-based. So that way, if you don't have reliable internet access, you can have it on a mobile device or on a computer for dynamically interacting and potentially customizing really specific to the users that are owning or most frequently using those devices.
And I did want to ask you memory, which is ironic. I was struggling to recall that. So I know that for therapy, for instance, one limitation in chatbots is that they don't have a long memory of, for instance, the prior conversations with the client. For tutoring, that's clearly an issue as well. Most of these, I assume, are kind of off-the-shelf chatbots that may remember the last session, but they're not going to know if the student asked the same question 3 weeks ago. Is that correct?
In general, what seems to be done on the back end for chatbots to have a memory of prior interactions is that some sort of user profile is saved, and then when the student begins their interaction or their chat session with the chatbot, that a under the radar prompt with a lot of information is sent that effectively simulates as if it was continuing an earlier conversation, or it is aware of things that had happened previously. But because chatbots themselves don't inherently have a long-term memory of prior interactions, that's yet another thing to think about in terms of how does a specific user and past interactions enter into that. But what we also know from a lot of social science research is that at different times, even in the classroom, we are sort of different people. There's some times when I am wanting to be a helper to others, and others where I want to be very under the radar, some where I'd want to be a clown, some where I want to be very knowledgeable. And so this idea that we present in different ways, and what are the social cues for knowing when and how we want to be engaged. One of the big things that has happened in education research has been trying to do dynamic affective state detection, because for teachers who are really experienced know that when a student is starting to feel bored, requires a different set of techniques than working with a student who's starting to feel very frustrated. And being able to detect those things and have computational technologies be responsive to that is an active area of work. And so for chatbots, which are oftentimes relying on text input and not necessarily all of the things that we look to as humans, like facial expression, body posture, recent history in terms of, how active someone was before compared to now and what we know about them in general, makes it a much more complex but really interesting challenge.
But for the memory seems particularly important, though, for really individualized learning. Like, let's say someone's learning a language. If the chatbot's going to really kind of emphasize the things they need to work on, how does it know that? And is that an issue today? Or are there workarounds for that?
I believe that's something that groups like Conmigo are examining, figuring out how to be consistent with students. So there's a few different models that we can approach with this. One is, you dynamically have a helper whenever you need, and it's just there just as much as a search engine. And whatever it is you need at the moment, you can ask for it. The idea of being able to build something that has a pretty extensive awareness of where you've been is discussed. It's something that has been recently envisioned, and like Los Angeles Unified had been hoping to pursue this and has been exploring it. I would caution, though, that LA Unified is under a bit of fire right now for their chatbot because the company that they contracted with had a zillion layoffs and is completely overwhelmed and does not seem to be able to deliver. And then there's been some whistleblower things about how data privacy has been handled. So I've been trying to refrain from mentioning LAUSD too much unless we want to talk about the care with which we need to think about or the complexity of it.
Well, what are 2 or 3 takeaways from that we can learn from?
For LAUSD, some of the takeaways to think about are, 1, data privacy and children and educational data are very regulated, and it is something that we have a lot of justified sensitivity about. And that is going to place some pretty unique demands on educational chatbot technology. Another is that another takeaway from LAUSD is that the things that we do to teach really well are really quite complex, and it's not strictly dynamic information delivery, but rather taking into account a lot of background information and making judgments from a lot of input at a given moment. And recognizing how complicated that is, that we need to build in things like memory, that we need to exercise professional judgment that is balancing an individual student's situation with where the standards are, with where the rest of the class is, where the teacher is, where the philosophy of teaching is in the classroom, whether it's going to involve promoting collaboration or trying to have students working on their own, are all hard things to be thinking about in terms of how to structure that. And then with some of the privacy things, Education really requires a quite large team. We may think of it as just individually a teacher, but there's communications with instructional coaches and leaders, other teachers who may not be that immediate classrooms teacher, special education teachers. And so knowing how and what information has to be brought in and considered in different contexts and which should be left behind is another challenge too.
And this is across a range of ages, from as young as kindergarten.
LAUSD was quite ambitious in thinking about their entire school system and the idea that you could go through the entire school system with a educational chatbot sort of companion that grows with you. And it's going to be a lot of things to think about with what does a kindergartner or early elementary student need to interact with versus what a high schooler and high schoolers who are heading on different journeys in their adulthood. I'd mentioned before also that there are usage restrictions for children under the age of 13, things that can be done with or without parent or guardian consent in there, and student assent as well. So there's a lot to think through in terms of a large-scale deployment and just the level of security of handling those data. We have regulations like FERPA, which makes it so our grades don't get released without our consent as adults throughout our lifetimes. We have also sensitive data that might include things involving social workers that are private. There can be some medical information or things that involve learning differences or learning disabilities that are in the mix that starts to get into HIPAA compliance. And considering regulations change over time as well, and there's always some gray area that gets worked out both in practice and in the courts, that is a tricky space to be occupying.
And overall, are educational AI a job threat to educators or a way to reduce drudgery and expand their reach?
So when we think about how might chatbots and generative AI impact the education profession, there are a couple of schools of thought that are emerging. One that I think is the most discounted right now is replace the teachers, to just have chatbot tutors for everybody, and that is how we do our education and our learning experiences. Although a lot of people who've thought about this have said that that's not a really good idea. Bill Gates at the first release of ChatGPT was quite adamant in his Gates Notes newsletter that this should be helping teachers, not replacing teachers. And the idea that we don't want to be replacing teachers, I think, is not just about wanting to protect teachers' jobs, but recognizing that teaching is a very complicated type of work that involves things that we really do need humans to be doing in there. A second school of thought that we're thinking about is that chatbot technology can increase efficiencies. And with teaching, it's largely known that teachers put in an inordinate amount of time in their work. They will pay for personal expenses, stay up late at night, work weekends, working summers, even if they're not on contract, to prepare their curriculum, to do other things in service of improving as teachers. And there's more work to be done than there are hours in the day. That's only increased over the years as there needs to be more documentation, more expectations for how things are being communicated and negotiated with different parties. So the thinking with the second school of thought that chatbots can be supportive of efficiencies is to try to reduce the demands of that workload so teachers can actually do the things that human teachers are really good at, to put in those relationships, to address topics and ways of thinking about topics that a chatbot is not well equipped to think about. And so in that sense, it's taking something that's overflowing with too many things and hopefully getting it down to a scale that's more reasonable for what teachers could do. A third school of thought is that it becomes a co-teacher or co-pilot in the classroom. So it's another tool in the mix, and it can do some very interesting things and be useful to have as part of the teaching repertoire. But it just becomes another way to structure or do lessons in the classroom. So in that sense, it would just change a bit the way that the teaching dynamic goes, because some things will produce more information because of the chatbot interactions, or the lesson activity would involve students working with or relying on a chatbot in certain portions, whether it's in small group work or in the ways in which they would deliver information, such as writing in a counterpoint to something that a chatbot had said, and then to then reappraise as part of a debate activity rather than students against students.
Yeah, what's the relationship between educators and educational AI? And you were just addressing that, but more specifically, so you would think of it as a teaching assistant. What you were just saying makes it sound like a teaching assistant.
So like some more examples of the types of things that teachers might ask you to use it for. In the classroom, it may be used as a recommended tutor to go and explore or revisit some topics that some students are having difficulty with. It may be used as a tool to help polish some of the writing that has been done. It could be used as a research tool to support, information gathering, just as much as perhaps using a search engine or Wikipedia would be part of the way that we would use things. It may be also outside of the classroom, used as an option for further review or as an exercise to go and try to stump the chatbot at home. There are concerns with out-of-school use of chatbot technology in that not every student has the same access. These services are increasingly looking towards freemium models, and so that is going to be changing some of the dynamics as well, not to mention the ongoing privacy concerns that would be involved. There can be assignments as well to just do novel chatbot creations. So, for example, make a chatbot that will talk and behave in certain ways or write things in certain ways, and to think about what are the requests or the elements that you'd want to put into it. There's a lot of real exciting possibilities for how teaching with chatbots can be done that go beyond tutoring. Tutoring is definitely important. It's something we know one-on-one tutoring can have really great effects. But there's a huge space of possibility for all the different things that a teacher or a student could do with a chatbot that they may not have been able to do otherwise, or they can do in a really fun or interesting way.
And all these are being tried out in some experimental fashion.
Yes, there's cases of teachers who are playing with this, and they're sort of boldly exploring what can be done. In general, have a bit more flexibility in how they develop their curriculum or what they know that their students have access to as well. And so that's happening. Some school districts, such as like Gwinnett County schools in Georgia, have really welcomed artificial intelligence and also teaching about artificial intelligence, thinking that understanding this, not just having it as something in the classroom, but something that we want to make sure schools help students to understand, just in preparation for going into a future adulthood and workforce that is going to have AI in a lot of different places, and be looking at chatbot technologies and know where they can be useful and where there are some really alarming or problematic things that we want to exercise caution or restrictions on.
Makes sense. And how do students generally respond to interacting with educational chatbots? Are there any notable trends or patterns in their engagement?
When chatbots were making a big splash in 2022 and into early 2023. A lot of students tried it out because they heard about it from others and were underwhelmed by the writing that was produced from chatbot technology. A lot of it is because the text sounded very plain and lacked style, and therefore they didn't find it very interesting to use. Some of that maybe not necessarily knowing that further prompts or thinking about other prompts could be in there, but it wasn't something that the students were as excited about or as alarmed about in the same way as teachers, parents, pundits. Also, the way in which young people interact with technology is not necessarily the same. So a lot of times they're interacting with chatbots through social media. Snapchat was one of the big ways in which they're interacting with AI and AI chat technologies, not ChatGPT, because that's embedded in a communication system that they use themselves a lot.
But that's, at least early on, Snapchat was still rules-based AI, or maybe
they were
Bayesian
incorporating more.
Bayesian, probably,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But simply by encountering AI in general, not chatbots in particular.
Right. And, right now, you could question whether this is chatbot-like, but nowadays Google search gives an AI-generated summary for a lot of queries. So anyone who is using search is going to be encountering those. However, what we've been seeing from surveys of young people's internet usage is it's the older folks who are using search engines like Google, and the younger folks are searching for things on YouTube and TikTok. Now, granted, YouTube is part of Google, but they are looking for a different kind of response rather than a bunch of blue links to go and sift through.
It's true. And how do you deal, not you personally, but how are educators dealing with chatbot hallucinations and bias? Is educating students about these a priority? And I think what you were saying in Georgia, teaching kids how to relate to AI. And what techniques are educators suggesting to students to verify chatbot answers?
Right now, with chatbots and the challenges of hallucinations and bias, it appears to be something that people who've been thinking a lot about these issues are really well aware of, but it's not something that is broadly aware to the large educational public. We've done some studies recently where teachers are not necessarily as concerned about student misinformation using chatbot technology, although that may be something that we need to put much more of our attention to. And then with respect to bias, there are a few cases that are broadly known that are cautionary that reach to AI in general, but understanding what that looks like within chatbot technology and why is something that a lot of educators are still needing to or wanting to learn more about themselves. What we look to in terms of addressing some of these is, first off, for misinformation, we're beginning to develop a lot more tools with information and media literacy practices and being more thoughtful about information sources. So that's been an endeavor that has been ongoing for some years, but still needs to develop further with chatbot engagements and technology to know that it can create false information or make things up. Making things up, though, however, is a bit of a gray area because sometimes we use the technology because we want it to make something up. We want it to make up a song. We want it to make up a story, and it may be a story involving the names of real individuals. So there are situations when we do want it to hallucinate, and that makes it a bit tricky for how to address that. So a lot of teachers are very concerned about how they would think of critical thinking with chatbot technology, but are in need of more tools or more ideas for how to instill that, and to think about what are the sources, can I find other ways to verify it, what are the other ways I would go and look to knowledge authorities that are in there, and understanding that chatbots tend to speak very confidently rather than with inherent caution. And while a lot of companies are putting in cautionary notes at the bottom, there's a lot of times that people just skip the cautionary notes on any technology. Now, with bias, there are tending to be teachers, especially in urban areas that serve diverse student populations, that are keenly aware of a lot of the bias cases that have appeared, and the ways that there are some negative stereotyping when prompted to do things in certain ways, or what are some of the defaults. And this becomes a really sensitive topic as well. There had been the case of Gemini's image generator technology that got a serious blowback from some very politically involved people because of the images that were generated when you asked for founding fathers or previous popes. And it showed people of many different races in those roles, which was, interesting and imaginative, but is something that was not necessarily representative of what we know from the historical record of those, and caused a bit of a backlash in there. And so that makes things a bit complicated in terms of bias and bias mitigation, because that Google effort and that Gemini effort was being thoughtful that when you say you want a rendering of a man, that man could be of any complexion, of any age and any appearance. And so what our defaults are and kind of our assumptions and when we expect to articulate those and how is part of a larger societal bias that is just baked into the way that we do things, and trying to accommodate that by showing a very diverse set of outputs seemed like was a way that people were not quite comfortable with at the start. And so it's a hard challenge to think about in there. There's also concerns about whether there's some things that are students feeding additional training data into the systems, and if that is an ethical use of how students interact. So if you take all of LAUSD's student population and were to use that data to get a sense of how a student population, say if it knew which students came from Spanish-speaking families, then would it start to develop some negative stereotypes there?
Interesting. But to develop negative stereotypes, but the training data would be kids from diverse backgrounds.
Yes, but there's ways in which, so like some famous examples that people have seen, not kid-specific, is that some things that are flagged for content moderation or content alerts rely on what slang a majority culture or a dominant culture uses. So in some communities, saying murder might be in the context of saying something very complimentary, but that's maybe construed by a system as a threat. And so there's different ways in which that gets influenced in there. And then when you look at any language community, there are things that characterize the community, but it's also always very dynamic and changing, and there's a lot of variety in there. If we look at Spanish speaking, there's a huge range in how Spanish is spoken from different nations, and how Spanish is spoken, or how much Spanish is spoken for people residing in the U.S., and how things such as class and gender and regions affect things just as much as in the U.S. We have dialectical tendencies for what we call sandwiches or water fountains or certain types of shoes, just based on what part of the country that you're in. And if I'm from Milwaukee, but I fly out to California, how's the chatbot supposed to refer to sandwiches or water fountains for me?
Or soda.
Soda. Firmly soda camp here.
Pop.
Yeah.
And so what type of training do educators need to effectively use chatbots?
Right now, we're seeing that educators need a range of trainings, so it's going to need to be a lot more than a one-size-fits-all chatbot 101, because the things that English teachers and history teachers are worrying about and are most interested in are a bit different from the things that science teachers and math teachers are wondering about. What some high school teachers are thinking about is a bit different from what middle school teachers are thinking about, and how much different segment groups have interacted with the technology. In research that we're doing, we find that lower elementary teachers are not considering themselves very familiar, and so just even knowing what everyone's talking about with AI and chatbots is a great start. But there are others who are generally aware but are thinking more about what are the specific ways to do new pedagogy or new ways of teaching with some of the chatbot technologies, and if there are things that are specific for their needs, whether it's with a linguistically diverse classroom or for specific subject matter or specific learning goals, depending on the area. So when we think about what training educators need, it's going to be, in some sense, a awareness and understanding of AI in terms of it's trained oftentimes on data for a lot of machine learning based AIs, and that there are biases associated, that there's misinformation that gets produced, that there's a lot of different ways that it could be used beyond just as tutoring systems, and what are our emerging norms for responsible use and how do we maintain those in schools, as well as what sorts of things it's important for us to impart to students as well. And so that becomes a specialized understanding, that thinking about what a fourth grader needs to learn about a chatbot versus what a 10th grader needs to learn about a chatbot can be quite different, and how to address those. So I think there's a pretty serious need right now for having some meaningful conversations and training experiences for teachers, but making sure that it's responsive to the vast variety that teachers are encountering and the specific needs and idiosyncratic ways that any individual teacher, even in sort of the same demographic or the same subject area or grade band, may use it differently from another teacher because they're stylistically different.
And looking forward, will we need formal testing at all when an educational chatbot can evaluate student learning based on maybe hundreds of hours of interaction with that student?
So could a chatbot be an interesting new way to give a larger assessment of students? It's possible in an area of interesting exploration, because we are trying to find more about people's trajectories of growth. And we are also trying to get a picture, a concise picture from a very complex background in there. However, thinking about assessment and testing, it's not strictly for those purposes only. There are ways in which assessment and testing is really for teacher feedback on specific lessons or activities. There is the opportunity for students who have had difficulty in one context to express strengths in another, and it could be within a test, rather than having to ask a lot of questions along the way to get to the test. And so it's something to be thinking about very carefully. There's certainly information that we could begin to get from there, but we need to, just like with any test measure now, be thoughtful about what it's saying and what we infer on the basis of that. If we see somebody with, a 740 SAT on the English and language portions and someone with a 720, how much stock do we put in the 740 being that much better than the 720? It depended on the day the test was taken. It depended on, which exact version of the test, what was the student's background in history. So these things get pretty complex. There is certainly data and information that could be useful, but with all assessment and all testing, we have to be really thoughtful, given how many different roles assessment and testing play in the education system.
Again, looking forward some period of time, are people thinking about essentially custom curricula generated for a student? I mean, in a sense, you don't need a textbook if a custom textbook can be developed either all at once or piece by piece for a specific student.
Yeah, one of the earliest dreams of how chatbots and AI technology could really change things is full customized curriculum specialized to any individual for their interests, needs, background, and where they're heading. And that's a question and I think a dream that has been held for a while, both with open educational resources and also with the larger curriculum ecosystem that we operate in, where there are publishing companies, state adoptions, and district adoptions and contracts that are involved. So as we look into the future, that might become part of the ecosystem just as much as teachers scouring for things online, some free curriculum, some commercially bought curriculum becomes part of that. And a lot of times teachers are putting together some amalgamation of all of these different things to create the learning experience that they want in there. The curriculum is a very interesting resource, but the question also comes up, well, what information is being used to train that? Recently in the academy, there's been a bit of an uproar in that one of the major academic publishers for a lot of scientific research has contracted with Microsoft to use all of their text, which is a lot, as part of their training. And that's something that, for a number of reasons, has been raising some hackles and some alarm bells because, just in terms of whose labor was associated. But I would also caution, as an academic myself, that the writing in there is not very conversational. So I'm not quite sure it's going to be the best distillation or conversational partner if it's overly trained on academic speak.
True, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. And then to sort of wrap up, what are the, what is your greatest hope for the future of chatbots or generative AI in education, and what's your greatest fear?
My greatest hope for chatbots is that it takes up some of the things that are pulling us away from the core of the learning experience, and enables people to ask the questions that they want to and get additional information that in a really robust learning environment can be part of the input and possibly useful in there, but treated with the appropriate skepticism or consideration that anything else, just as much as having picked up a good book at the library or a book from one historical perspective or one point of view, and knowing that that's one thing coming into the classroom amongst others, and to streamline things that are not the best use of people's time and could be a great use of technology time, so long as it doesn't become additive and create more work for teachers, because you may end up with a situation where they have to know the textbook, they have to know the specific things from the district, and they have to know how the chatbot is going to respond. So that just increases things because you can't quite part with some of these other pieces for very complicated reasons. My greatest fear with chatbot technology in education is that we vastly overestimate what it is capable of doing and we vastly underestimate what teaching involves. And I think that that's going to be a very inequitable outcome, and also has a high risk for just being a bad learning experience for a number of students for whom we might even think it's a good learning experience. When we think about customization, oftentimes it's how is it best suited to an individual, and in education, we actually want things that are not necessarily suited. You want perspectives that are different. You want to be challenged to think about things in a way that is unfamiliar or hard, and unexpected. And, if we just let everyone pick their own diet, will they still pick broccoli? And we do know that there's some ways in which broccoli can be quite valuable. And how do we make sure that it's prepared well and not just covered in chocolate?
Some of the same concerns as for relationship chatbots in a way.
Yes.
Choose your own adventure, and you never choose anything uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And I think that underestimating that the relationships in schools and the experiences, it's not strictly the textbook. School is a lot of things. For some kids, it's the safe place to be. For other kids, it's when they see their friends. And for other kids, it's a chance to be somebody who they don't feel like they get to be in other contexts. For some, it's childcare. And these are all important. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic and the remote learning period was illustrative with respect to how there are still a lot of inequities, and that having kids, learn just via the laptop does not solve or fill the gap that is left behind when we don't have schools and interactions with people and teachers.
Is anyone experimenting with chatbots given, some sort of robot body or whatever? For education.
I have not seen in the US chatbots with physical embodiment so much as with virtual embodiment. In places like Japan and Korea, there's I think more work on some very interesting robotics approaches and technologies, but that has not been a dominant focus within education. There's a whole interesting area of how we use our bodies in teaching and learning. Gesture is a very big deal in supporting learning, and there's interesting studies about gesturing more under certain circumstances imparts stronger understandings than not gesturing, or having gestures that are not compatible with the things that you're talking about can be a concern. So those are just, skimming the surface of a lot about how teachers' bodies are important in the work, both in terms of where they are in the classroom. When the teacher stands by a student, that can change the dynamic, and they sometimes selectively do that because they know there's something to monitor or to communicate to a student that they need to modify a little bit of what they're doing at a given time. There's ways in which, leaning over a chair and having a private conversation, does something and establishes a moment of trust to talk about a topic as well. And so I think would need to have a lot more progress on robotics, informed by a lot of research on embodiment and communication before we can take that notion really seriously.
And then this is really just, in case I missed something, now I've been assuming that most AI in education is deep learning based, neural, but were there rules-based or statistical approaches used for any kind of real chatbot in education that I should know about?
For chatbots,
because there's been lots of rule-based chatbots, but not for education, as far as I know.
Yeah, a lot of the classic tutoring technologies that had virtual tutors had tended to be rule-based technologies. And
what's an example?
A lot of the things that are coming out of Carnegie Mellon University and the I can't remember the name of sort of the spin-off, but it's Carnegie Learning. Carnegie Learning's technology has been informed by decades of research on tutoring and speccing out knowledge maps within various domains, and also different ways for the tutoring system to provide information. Now, you could question whether that is a chatbot per se because of how dynamic the interaction
But
is.
it's a back and forth. It's
There
iterative in
is
some
back and
fashion.
forth. And there's also been other role-based things with like virtual persona type entities. So at Stanford, in collaboration with Vanderbilt, there'd been a project where you teach a virtual avatar the things, and to see if your explanation of it, as you spec out with rule sets, leads that avatar to make the same inferences that you're intending for it to make. So that's definitely been in there. Statistical.
But that was for AI research or as an application?
That's been for application as a intervention. So the idea of learning by teaching and asking students to be the teachers of some virtual entity. There has been work to support tutors. So having a chatbot to support someone who wants to do something helpful by tutoring or volunteering their time, but they need a few prompts themselves in terms of when to encourage support or what things to follow up about. And so that's an active project, as well as to how to make more effective sort of ad hoc teachers and ad hoc tutors, or even to improve how teachers do things themselves in terms of how they facilitate class conversations. So there's been some technology that's really focused on dashboards and not as much the chatbots, but it is using some various AI techniques and statistical techniques. There's some classic work with statistical natural language processing, latent semantic analysis, especially to look at students' writing to see if there's evidence that they had read the thing that was assigned based on semantic similarity in there. And so that's been a couple decades old, but was definitely getting things moving in that direction. Not necessarily a chat so much as appraising.
Natural language processing.
Yeah, that's some of the early natural language processing things that...
what was that called?
I think Summary Street. So Walter Kinch at the University of Colorado Boulder, I believe, was associated with it. And he did a lot of the original, some core reading comprehension research that is in there. One use that I would like to mention is, a little bit of a tangent, but in art classes, especially with chatbots being able to render images on demand, there's a lot of alarm in terms of, are we going to value the work of artists in the same way? Are the practices and craft of art still going to be taught? And in the examples with art teachers whom we've spoken with, oftentimes it's use this to get some initial ideas or starter things to begin with to help you in this iterative process, rather than to have it just be the art product itself. And to think about more, since creating a work of art often involves multiple iterations and initial concept to begin with. And so there's ways in which it can be used in other pedagogies that are not just, the STEM or humanities ones per se. Yeah. I think that's probably most of the tutoring or chat type technologies. And there's just been some machine learning things on affect detection, and then it will change the way the tutoring responds, but that's using typically sensors or pupil dilation, things like that, as added input in addition to what students are entering or responding with.
Yeah, the sort of emotional AI
Yeah,
stuff.
affective computing types of things with the tutoring systems.